Hello, it's a pleasure for me to be able to share some of my work today with this amazing group of people. I apologize that I'm not there in person. A last minute health hiccup has prevented me from traveling right now, but I'm very glad that Alexander and his team could beam me up for this talk. So I'm not present in person or, in fact, live to be able to interact with you, but I hope that you will give me feedback on Twitter or Instagram. My handle on both these social media platforms is lately on time. It's lately on time. And at the end of the talk, I'm going to charge you with a collective task to hopefully continue the conversation that this talk transpires. Now, I'm supposed to talk about experimentation today. Not because experimentation is new, but because it's a question that seems to be posed with hostility towards humanities and cultural studies these days. Experimentation seems to invoke the ideas of scalability, verifiability, integrity, objectivity, which are in fact questioned discreetly even in fundamental science labs. However, in the time of imminent catastrophes, experiments, it would seem, are embedded with surplus optimism that hopes to save the world. Now, I want to be clear that I'm not talking about experimentation as a human spirit of innovation and curiosity, but experimentation as a particular form of knowledge production that has been claimed by science and technology labs and constrained by the setup of the apparatus and an adherence to black box investigations that happen within isolated and forcibly separated spaces. So I'm talking about experimentation not at individual levels, charting new territories of thought and knowledge, but about the scientific institutional setup which promotes certainty over instability, specificity over variability, and knowability over speculation. And again, because experimentation takes up so many different forms, I'm particularly focusing only on social and cultural experiments that emerge because of the presence of digital technologies. So, digital technology driven experimentation has become the battle cry of our times and manifests itself in all kinds of spaces. From DIY cultures that think that every individual is a creative hacker who can now produce social hacks to change our immediate environments, to design thinking, where governments and policy actors are thinking about designing solutions through experimentation. It pops up in crowdfunding imagination of letting a million flowers bloom, encouraging people to capitalize their relationship in the forms of social networks, and it is present in creating informal experiments like Airbnb and Uber, trying to commodify our free time, our leisure and social relationships, even our homes, our cars, our time, and our care, to produce precarious and perilous forms of social organization. So, technological experimentation has become this great conceptual trope where it is simultaneously the question to be asked, answer to the question, the parameter of evaluating the impact of that answer, and the endpoint of the entire process. And I know it sounds really claustrophobic, but because it is. Take, for example, the role that experimentation thinking plays in developing technological societies. One of my most illustrative stories is from India, where in the mid 2000s, India was experiencing a connectivity revolution. We had a grand plan to make India digital by connecting the country on the information superhighway. In those days, I used to work with a public private partnership that was seeking to address a very dire problem in the country. India, among all the developing countries, is a nation that has the highest number of farmer suicides. We're averaging at 41 farmers killing themselves every day due to collapsing infrastructure, exploitative profiteering by private companies like Monsanto, predatory financing schemes of microfinance corporations, and an apathetic state which seems both uncaring and paralyzed by the mammoth failure of welfare for the largest professional community in that country. In the middle of the last decade, it was decided that digital technological experimentation will perhaps create better safety systems for the farmers. And after 4 years of national surveys and researches, it was proposed that we need most urgently right now is for farmers to have access to information about crops, about irrigation, about weather, about prices, about subsidies they get from the governments, about loans and ways of coping with debt and destitution. Across the last decade, in close collaboration with private firms like Microsoft and Oracle, the Indian government built experimental schemes that would bring relief to the farmers. I was a part of the implementation teams of one such project in Bangalore, where we quickly realized that the experimental nature of this exercise was not only flawed, but futile. We were helping set up computers and connectivity in regions which have such a huge electricity deficit that most farmers were not able to irrigate their fields and farms. These were villages that had about 3 to 4 hours of electricity a day. Sometimes it would come only in the middle of the night, and there was no way this community was going to spend its precious time trying to learn computing and accessing information. And yet, at a massive cost, the experiment continued. We now have villages that are well connected with some of the latest gadgets, but have no electricity or provisions for digital literacy for the community to use this infrastructure. It's our own version of a digital ghost town. And yet, this particular experiment is considered to be a success in its pilot state, because experimentation in this case is a technological black box. While evaluating this experiment, the question at hand was whether it had reached its technological goals, and in all measures it had. The fact that there was a computer with an internet connection in every village of the state, that the government services had digitized their entire knowledge to be available on the farming communities, and that the farmers had transparent access to various resources were all considered as significant victories of technological experimentation. And stories came, about farmers sitting behind computers, presumably reading important weather forecasts and listening to podcasts on resilient agriculture. Though I'm convinced that if they are anything like you and me, they were largely just pirating movies or watching porn. Anyways, the experiment failed to account for the fact that the number of farmer suicides in the subsequent years has only gone up. As Solomon Benjamin, a keen critique of the project, has very sardonically pointed out, this is experimentation at its best. The farmers are still dying, but they are now empowered in their death because they know the exact information about the circumstances of their dying. This is the technological driven experimentation as a black box, which produces a variety of buzzwords that all seem to hold the promise of transformation and change, but seem to serve only one purpose: to extend and expand the scope of the experiment. Which is why, when we are faced with the failure of technology experiments, we fall back on true pre wired responses. Either we believe that we need more experiments and that the current investment in experimentation is not enough, or we agree that the number of people participating in experimental practices is low and hence it's not reaching its desired scope. So we need to find better tools for experimentation, or we need to find more people to join the process. And we continue this discourse through specific focus on different processes that make us believe that change is just around the corner, that technological experimentation is going to be disruptive, and it will dislocate the narratives of threat and misery, and the promises of technology are soon going to bear fruition. Now, I know I sound like a gloomy Gus, but I promise I'm not here to foretell gloom and doom and dire consequences of experiments within the humanities when it intersects with technology. Instead, I'm more interested in thinking through and understanding what experimentation really means, and how do we understand the conditions within which experimentation happens, the bodies that get to legitimately experiment, and the machinery that validates the efficacy and impact of these experiments. And I'm going to do that by particularly looking at the internet as an entry point and examining some of the key steps of experimentation that we've taken for granted. And I'm going to do this through 3 different stories, drawing from a feminist and post-colonial critique of digital cultures. Perhaps one of the most resounding promises of experimentation is in participation and collaboration, right? It's the holy grail of digital experimentation, because following in Tim Berners-Lee's glorious pronouncement, the internet is the new leveler. It is democratic. It is egalitarian. It gives equal access for participation, and the alternative voices can be heard, and the world can be reordered through information exchange. And while all that's fine as the promise of the internet, let's get real. If you are online, you're spending most of your time exchanging pictures of cute cats or doing things that you want to delete from your browser history. In fact, the maximum innovation that has happened online and experimentation has been in ways by which we can see naked people doing strange things to themselves and to each other. If we were ever to think about the most social and technological experiments, it's not going to be Wikipedia and Google, but Pornhub and Cam4. And this is not just a random provocation. The dissonance of where experimentation resides and where we look for is not new. Experimentation is sterile. It requires a lab-like cleanness and is very rarely allowed to have the associations of dirt and smut that are its natural origin points. Let me take you through a personal story that illustrates quite well the exciting and racy world of participatory and collaborative experimentation and its consequences. So, when I was a teenager in India, I had a close set of friends, and we all bonded on the fact that we loved books. So, growing up near the desert where the temperature would shoot up to 45 degrees in the summer, we often spent long summer afternoons in libraries, inhabiting fantasy worlds so far, far away. By the time I was a teenager, I had come to love books quite intensely. I knew that books could make me laugh, they could make me cry, they could infuse in me a sense of danger and adventure, and that they could keep me mellow and enchanted for hours to no end. And in that summer of 94, my friends and I discovered something else that books could do. Not to make too fine a point of it, but we discovered this incredible book called Letters to Penthouse in the Health and Science section of the public library. Now, how that book got there, what visionary librarian ordered it, how it continued to exist in the library is a mystery on its own. But for 5 hormonal teenage boys, the discovery of a book that is purportedly written by adults about their deepest sexual desires and fantasies was like the finding of paradise. Our first instinct was to issue the book and never return it, except that we quickly found out that the book was in a non-lending, reference-only section of the library, which of course makes sense because surely a book that explained to you the ways by which to seduce your stepbrother's aunt and speculated on what comes next should be in an easy reference section to support the lost soul. Anyway, to come to the point, here we had a book like no other book and nowhere to take it to. And so in that very quiet summer of 1994, 5 boys took it upon themselves to sit down through long afternoons, copying the book, sentence by sentence, word by word, in respectable-looking notebooks, our tongues sticking out and our fingers stained with ink, running to the bathrooms when the task became too unmanageable. It took us the better part of 10 weeks to copy the entire book. And what we had at the end of those 10 weeks were 5 different sections of this book, each written by a separate person, ready to be circulated for the sheer joy of reading. We didn't realize then, but we were actually following the footsteps of famous scribes of the 12th and 13th century who actually used to perform a similar task with the Holy Book, transcribing it, copying it, and then circulating it. And as scribes, we also realize that this act of copying is not a slavish act of imitation. It is, in fact, innovation through participation. It is experimentation of different forms because as we copied, we added our own content to this experimental writing. Sometimes it was content which was an expression of the desire. Sometimes it was content that was indicative of the emotional state that we wrote in, the jerkiness of the handwriting, the half-written sentences, the pauses taken in the middle of a letter that was too racy. And this experiment, which started in a closed-door library, eventually became a social experiment because the text circulated. As it circulated, we added, edited, annotated, and remixed the content to it over the next 5 years of growing up. More than 200 readers had read and contributed to it. At the end of the 5 summers, our modest book, which had originally taken 280 pages, had grown into a 1,000-page epic of the dirtiest, smuttiest, most bizarre and fascinating pornography ever in the hands of teenagers. And one day, the book died. It fell into the hands of authority as it was being circulated surreptitiously, covered in brown paper. When that book was found, we were not celebrated as the new cultural heroes and social experimentators who were trying to kind of do collaborative writing. There was a quest to figure out who was responsible for it, but by that time, the book did not belong to just one person. It belonged to an entire grade in the school of about 200 students all of them incriminated in their handwriting as they added and innovated not only at the level of the content, but also at how a book gets written. Now, I'm not saying that Wikipedia stole our ideas, but I do want to pay attention to the fact that experimentation of projects like Wikipedia uh, is not often the fate that every experimenter meets. Because when the true nature of this incredible collaboration came to light, the principal of my school decided to punish the entire class, suspending all our breaks and playtime for a month and sending a letter to our parents. These forms of penalization and punishment of experimenters continues in the world of the digital. On the one hand, experimentation is offered as a clear answer to our cultural questions. I'm not a pirate, I'm an experimenter. I'm not a plagiarist, I'm an experimenter. I'm not a copier, I'm an experimenter. Digital experimentation has been seen as subversive, radical, democratic, and resistant. It has the power to go back to the utopia of the commons. Once you experiment, you have questioned the hegemony and shackles of the giant traditional industries. And yet, a closer look at experimentation tells us that it's designed, engineered, contained, and controlled in ways that might be hidden under the celebratory rhetoric. That the authorship of experimentation is still up for grabs and hugely controlled by the regulatory mechanisms that are set in place. My second point is about the universalism myth of experimentation and how the story of experimentation is, in fact, the story of punishment. There is a general idea that experimentation is accessible to all, and when it happens, it will always be appreciated for what it is. However, there is a definite axis of authenticity which creeps in when these conversations begin. Because this did not work out for an Indian writer whose name is Ashwini Bhatt. Ashwini Bhatt writes in the Gujarati language, which is spoken in the states of Gujarat in the northwest of India. It's a small language, about 6 million people speak it. Bhatt is primarily a translator, and he made his career out of translating John Grisham and James Headley Chase novels from English into Gujarati. For a decade or so, he was the voice of Gardner and had indeed perfected the oeuvre of legal drama, suspense, moral dilemmas, and fast-packed action sequences that the Gardner novels always have to offer. But one day, Bhatt, who is a prolific translator, ran out of Gardner novels to translate. He had translated everything that was on the market, and so he tried other famous English bestsellers, like John Grisham and Sidney Sheldon, but none of them worked. Apparently, Bhatt's genius was so attuned to the Gardner repertoire that his readers did not like see him reading him translating other authors. And so after a couple of years of trying out other people, Bhatt went back to translating more Gardner and James Headley Chase novels. His return was hugely celebrated, and in fact, in the next 6 years, Bhatt went on to translate 14 more Gardner novels, each one a bigger success than the other. Now, here comes the strangeness. When you try and locate the originals of these 14 novels, you quickly realize that they don't exist. In fact, Bhatt has now written more novels by Gardner than Gardner himself has. Or in other words, when Bhatt ran out of Gardner novels to translate, he started writing original fiction in the own genre, but continued to attribute it to Gardner, and nobody was wiser. However, the Gardner estate eventually sued Bhatt for intellectual property rights and trademark infringements. When Bhatt was interviewed about this, he saw himself as an experimenter, as adding to the genre that Gardner had invented without asking for any money. Bhatt said that he never thought of his act as a crime. In his head, he was an experimenter translating the genre that Gardner had started and was continuing in the legacy of translation and authorship that he thinks is the necessary precondition of creativity. But by every account, is an experimenter as we understand it. He took up a scarce product, reverse engineered it, and then created something new that contributed to the cultural milieu of his writing. And yet he was not allowed to be an experimenter, because his experiment did not benefit those who hold power, because he was producing something that was not an extension of their economic practice. His experiments were considered illegal. And this has parallels to other historic moments in the story of digital experimentation. Take the story of Apple and its positioning as a creative tool. In the late 90s, when Apple was challenging IBM, I hope you remember that magnificent 1984 ad that they had released. When the Mac hit the market, one of its most memorable advertisement campaign was called Rip, Burn, Mix. With the new Mac, the ad suggested, you will stop being a user and become an experimenter. The capacity to copy, to remix, to redistribute, to share what the digital offered was the promise of a Mac. And so strong has been this branding experiment that till date, a Mac connotes not only affordable elitism, but it's also the experimental toolkit of a creative industry. So, in the same year that Apple was introducing the world to the joys of digital experimentation, there was a concentrated lobbying by the American trade bodies to crack down on the pirate markets in India. As one of the quickly growing market base for cheap and knockoff digital cultural production, India had easily become, by 2005, a space where entrepreneurs had produced their own products of remixed experimentation. From fake digital imitations to remixed and pirated discs, the market was thriving. However, the music and film industry of America, which by the way literally spells out mafia, right? Like Music and Film Industry Association of America, it negotiated with the Indian government as a part of its trade treaties that the government shall enforce strong laws to stop the Indian population from ripping, burning, and mixing of digital content. And to make their point strongly, they put on the table the right to reverse engineer a drug to cure malaria. In a country where malaria is the third largest cause of death, having affordable access to cheap medication is important. And the mafia lobby held the rights to this drug hostage in return of the Indian digital user not be allowed to experiment like the American counterpart Mac users. These are all stories that bring to the fore the very simple fact that is often forgotten in the experiment celebration, that experimentation is not necessarily a smooth and happy process. It's not radical or subversive, but is actually allowed by the very structures it questions. Not anybody who experiments is allowed to be an experimenter. We need to think about not experimentation at the edges, trying to exploit people in precarious conditions to produce creative solutions. Instead, we need to start thinking of the edges of experimentation as we interact with it through humanities and cultural studies. It's important to start looking not only at what is allowed as an experimentation, but to pry open the black box of an experiment and see that which is not visible, that which is being censored, suppressed, and punished. I want us to take a pause to remember that pharmaceutics in India are unable to build their own inventions. The never-ending book of collaboratively written porn, which was not allowed to be an experiment because it wasn't sterile. The story of Ashwini Bhatt and his act of translations that did not require originals. And the geographical monopoly where bodies can innovate, rip, burn, mix, and not die of malaria in order to rethink what constitutes our understanding of experimentation. I'm urging us today, as we kickstart our conversations, to think about not the work of doing experiments, but the processes of regulation, control, and influence that define the parameters of experiments and allows or excludes people from experimenting. Or more clearly, the question at hand is not how shall we experiment from within the humanities, but how shall we critique and understand who gets to experiment and what are the costs of life, being, and dignity when experimentation becomes a technological conversation that does not look at the bodies that have to bear the cost of the experimental impulse. And I'm going to stop here with one tiny request to all of you. Because we don't have a question and answer session today, I thought it would be really useful for us to enter into a collective conversation. I'm going to request you to turn to the person sitting next to you and spend the next 3 to 5 minutes trying to think through this question of the experiment and the humanities through the three axes that I have offered for you to kind of unravel the black box. One is the question of authorship, right? Who gets to author an experiment? who becomes invisible in the process, who becomes delegitimized is one question. The second is the question of authenticity. There is a certain idea that only some experiments are authentic in nature. They follow fixed formats of regulation and processes and verification, and anybody who does not meet that protocol is immediately made illegitimate or disqualified from the experimental setup. And the third question is the question of authority. What are the mechanisms by which something is recognized as an experiment? And what are the ways in which an experiment finds its legitimacy in order to be accepted as a social and cultural truth? So it would be really great if you could just turn to your neighbor and talk briefly on around questions of authorship, authority, and authenticity, and see if you have a story to share. See if this is something that makes sense in your own personal practice, but also in the different kinds of sites that you might be researching right now, and see if there is a small exchange that is possible. And if you are feeling generous and want to include me in these conversations, and I really hope you do, it would be fantastic if you could tweet or Instagram me. Again, my handle is lately on time. And if you have this 5-minute conversation, then just tweet me at lately on time with a question, an idea, a comment, a story, a link of something that you think is relevant to our understanding of this relationship between humanities and experimental natures. And I really look forward to following up with you in the digital world, or indeed in the physical world, if travel and mobility are restored again. So thank you very much for your patience, for listening to this disembodied voice with like a long video which goes on forever. Thank you for the team at the organizing the entire conference for allowing me to send in a video recording when I could not come in presence myself. And I really look forward to the conversations that you have, both online and offline, with me and with each other for the rest of the conference. I wish you all the best for this event, and thank you very much for your listening. Bye.